Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb riff. This is a special holiday edition of The New Untouchables meets David Sirota, who a lot of people obviously recognize because he's been in the mix of it for a long time. Obviously, David Sirota started off his career, at least to my knowledge, being a speechwriter to Bernie Sanders, and boy, what an inspiration that was at the time. And of course, he's currently the editor in chief of The Lever, which I read frequently. And anybody who obviously is interested in all deep dives of investigation and of journalism, please check out The Lever, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But I want to just introduce the group here. Those of you who watch The New Untouchables, you're obviously familiar with a lot of these folks. But what I'm going to do is just give them a quick introduction because they might not be as well known as David Sirota. And right to my left, currently on my screen, is June Carbone. She is the Rubina Chair of Law, Science, and Technology at the University of Minnesota. Right below her is, of course, the indomitable William K. Black, master of all things regulation, going back to the savings and loan crisis and everything that's come since. Obviously, somebody who gives us much keen insight on corruption, regulation, economics, and where they all intersect with the law. And then down below, of course, is none other than Paul Peltier, the veteran of the Department of Justice, currently in independent practice as an adjunct professor at George Washington University. But the sum total of these folks know a thing or two about corruption. And of course, that's going to be the focus of this particular conversation. And I would just want to start off here, just kind of introducing a couple of things on my screen share. And of course, we're not doing the big production value here, unfortunately, but it definitely goes without saying that if you don't know that David Sirota was a co-writer on one of the most masterful comedic executions of insane reality, and David, in a lot of my dialogue, I always like to talk about, growing up with the influence of National Lampoon and all of the satire that obviously was very influential in both of our lives as it intersects with reality. But I can't believe it was 2021 that the master class in this sort of satire, starring none other than Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio and Jonah Hill, among others, Meryl Streep. I mean, oh my God, it doesn't go Ariana Grande, Timothy Chalamet, and it was just magnificent. And I can't believe it was 2021. But every single day I wake up and I look at the headlines, I think of your film. In fact, I just happened to watch it a couple of days ago to inspire us moving forward, because I don't think the satire gets any more insane than what's on the front page of probably The Lever today, but also on the New York Times. Trump is said to plan a new class of battleships named for him. Wonderful, just after he put his name right next to President Kennedy. And then not so funny, because like you, David, I appreciate renewable energy and always have. And Trump, of course, holds 5 leases of wind farms, all but gutting U.S. offshore wind industry. And then, of course, moving forward, we could talk about last night's scenario with Barry Weiss and all things, let's just say, boy, the love and joy of Larry Ellison taking over Paramount or bidding with Netflix, your former partners, of course. But again, we're here to discuss Master Plan, the hidden plot to legalize corruption in America. And man, I have been really looking forward to this dialogue. I've been paying attention to, everything that you've said about this book, because I got to tell you, David, when I first started off trying to, wrap my head around Citizens United, I was immediately dumbstruck by all things Powell Memo and everything that came since. And here you are after years of research in the midst of all of the other important things you've been doing, and you decided to write this sort of deep dive on the ancillary of everything that I think has created the architecture of the world we actually live in. Please launch us and tell us why you did that.
Yeah, so I think that people feel like that corruption is endemic, and I think they're right. And I think a lot of people feel like corruption is almost a force of nature, that it's an unavoidable consequence or feature of our American democracy, and maybe even, sort of human civilization. And I think at one level that's true. There's always going to be some level of corruption. I think what I wanted to do in both the audio series that we did called Master Plan and the book based on the audio series was to look at the roots of how that corruption was not just not rooted out, but was actually enshrined and legalized in the United States. I think and I think when you think about that, that's not inevitable. That is not some sort of force of nature. That is a set of choices, really a plan, a plot that was created uh, to do that. And I think what we wanted to do was show how that plot was engineered and then executed. And it does start with the Powell memo, in the sense that the Powell memo was, I wouldn't necessarily call it an incredibly detailed blueprint. It was more I would put it on more on the manifesto side of the ledger. You know, we have famous manifestos that are seen as the opening starter gun of movements. I think the Powell memo was the beginning of a movement to create a detailed plan to legalize corruption through our courts, through our legislatures, through Congress, and it starts with the Powell memo, and there's some mythology around the Powell memo, or that we went into knowing when we did this project, that the idea has been sort of thrown out there that, yeah, this guy Lewis Powell wrote this memo, and it was his generation's version of kind of a uh, maybe, an angry Reddit thread, but it didn't really go anywhere from there. That's been sort of the the mythology around the Powell memo. And the Powell memo, for those who don't know, was written by Lewis Powell, who at the time was a prominent lawyer, corporate lawyer, coming out of the tobacco industry. He was politically well connected, and he wrote this memo saying that essentially corporate America, the elite executive class, is under attack in America. He's looking out at an America where Ralph Nader is winning lots of fights, legislative fights in Congress, and he's sort of a call to arms. And soon after, very, very, very soon after, a couple months after, he gets appointed to the Supreme Court. And the mythology in retrospect has been, this was just, yeah, it says a lot of what happened. And if you read it in retrospect, it's kind of Nostradamus-like about what the conservative movement did to take over the courts, to take over American politics, to buy the policies it wanted to buy. But that it only looks Nostradamus-like in retrospect. It didn't actually really go anywhere. And what we uncovered in our reporting is that that's actually the opposite of true. That we uncovered for the first time all sorts of documents detailing how that memo was not only written, it was acted upon in a very deliberate and specific set of ways, through the Chamber of Commerce. There was a meeting at Disney World with a number of very, very powerful corporate executives. They created a task force on the Powell memo that included top executives at major corporations, including, by the way, top executives at major media corporations. They laid out plans for what they specifically wanted to do. That first meeting in 1974, excuse me, 1973. One of the focuses was on how to weaken the post-Watergate campaign finance bills that were moving through Congress to allow corporations to be better able to buy elections. And out of that, the loopholes that they got inserted, that Powell Memo task force helped get inserted into the law. So rose the modern corporate political action committee. From there was another series of meetings at after Gerald Ford got into the White House. There was another series of meetings tracking all that had been done by the Powell Memo task force, legislatively, in popular culture, with movies, through the media, the seeding of op-eds, radio actualities, et cetera, et cetera. So this was really a real movement with real action items. And of course, it moved into the courts with a series of court rulings that ended up genuinely, quite literally, legalizing the buying and selling of elections. Started with the Buckley v. Valeo case, which enshrined a then radical notion that money in politics is not corruption, money in politics is constitutionally protected speech. Lewis Powell himself engineered soon after that. Now that he was on the Supreme Court, after writing the Powell Memo, Lewis Powell engineered a ruling extending those rights those free speech rights to spend money in elections, extending those rights to corporations, and that Bilotti ruling, as it was called, ended up being the foundation of Citizens United. So that's the story we tell in Master Plan, and the hope is that people read this and they have a better understanding of not only how the current corruption became endemic, but they have a sense that the creation of the endemic nature of that corruption wasn't a force of nature. It was created by a specific set of people with a specific set of plans and with a specific set of objectives. And I think the one moral to that story is it's not a force of nature, which means that it can be reversed. And we can talk about how to start reversing the master plan, but it is just a reminder that this was not an inevitability. The world we're living in now was created by mere mortals to get the outcomes that they're getting now.
Jen, you want to start us off?
Yes. So I'm incredibly excited about the book. And as I mentioned, I have my own book that came out with my co-authors in 2024, looking at the state of women in corporate America and finding they were losing ground. And when we looked, what we found was the same story everywhere. Uh, Jack Welch in earnings management, Walmart and wage theft, Wells Fargo and the fake account scandal. More women were fired at Wells Fargo than men, even though the men often committed worse elements. And the story underlying all these things, I've got stories about private equity and, uh, hedge funds. Uh, every story is the same story, a selection for people who could break the law and get away with it. And and do so in a way that preserved plausible deniability. So I have a couple of questions. My main one is Simon and Schuster edited out almost everything we had to say about the Powell memo and the history that leads to this. How did you keep it in your book? I'm impressed. It's a good story, well told. But the more serious question, how pervasive is the resulting corruption? So we spent a lot of time poking around. And, when you look at Jack Welch, what made Jack Welch famous at General Electric? He bragged about getting rid of the bureaucracy. What he was really doing was engineering earnings management. He rewarded with high stakes bonuses the executives who produced the right numbers. GE later paid several hundred million in fines for securities fraud, but it didn't matter. Jack Welch had retired by that point, a slap on the wrist. When we wanted to say, what's the legacy of that? We couldn't find out. The estimates from accounting people are between 40 to 70% of publicly traded firms engage in earnings management. That's a huge number, and not all of that's illegal. Same thing with Walmart. Walmart's a little bit better. I mean, the name of the game is biggest class action, U.S. history and sex discrimination. What's really going on is a selection for managers who would oppress their employees. Walmart's number one in the country in wage theft. But the story there is not only the big box stores getting together and massive political contributions. By the way, focused on Jeb Bush, who then spoke to W. And one of the first things George W. Bush did when he became president was to fire the general counsel at the NLRB, who was about to bring this enormous lawsuit against Walmart for union busting. That went away, never came back. 2006, the Walmart lawyer involved in managing the campaign got appointed head of the Wages and Hours Division of the Department of Labor. And so it's pervasive. It wasn't originally, but it is now. How do you even get your head around the consequences?
Yeah, I mean it pervasive is the right word, endemic is the right word. I mean, I use the metaphor that David Foster Wallace used from his famous speech, where, the famous speech is that it's a commencement address, and I'll paraphrase it. I'll probably butcher it too, but it's, two fish are sitting in the water, and another fish swims by, and the other fish swims by and says, "Hey guys, how do you like the water today?" And one of the two fish turns to his friend and says, "What the hell is water?" Right? The idea being that if you're a fish immersed in water, you don't necessarily know you're immersed in water. And I think that actually is, in a sense, the objective. The objective is to, well, the objective, one question that came up in our book is who would be for legalizing corruption? Why would you want to legalize corruption? And I think the answer to that is at the time that the Powell memo was initiated and written and executed upon, there was a perception among the corporate elite that the democracy is sent, they wouldn't put it this way, but essentially their argument was the democracy was working too well. Okay, that what the people wanted, the government was giving the people what it wanted. And this, there's sort of the underneath it, this idea that the government was allowing for effectively mob rule, right? The idea being that if the government becomes too responsive to the people, that their theory would be you don't necessarily want that. And let's remember that fear of that is at the founding of our whole country. Right? I mean that's why they created a U.S. Senate. That's why they sort of distributed power in part because they were afraid of people having too much power. And not to go all, history lesson, but it was a palpable fear in that era in part because of the perception of the French Revolution, right? And we're talking back in the 1700s, early 1800s, right? We want democracy, but we don't want too much democracy. So in the 1970s, there's sort of a similar tone of the arguments being made about Ralph Nader and the consumer movements and the like, and their success that we're risking the government tipping over to becoming too responsive to what the mob wants, aka what the people want. And I think the goal was we the elite are not getting what we want out of the government. And the only way we're going to be able to get what we want out of the government is to move away from a one person, one vote functioning democracy and more towards a $1, one vote system, and to get what they wanted, so that what the people wanted on all sorts of economic issues would be less prioritized by the government. So that's the question of why would you want corruption? I think to perpetuate that system, you have to then move towards not only legalizing it, but normalizing it at a level where it feels so endemic that it goes from being illegal to being legal, from scandalous to being not scandalous, to uncouth to being just business as usual. And I think we're now in the stage of where the legalization campaign has reached its almost cartoonish extremes. I mean, we're talking right now a year and a half after the Supreme Court handed down a ruling. And you sound insane recounting this ruling, even though this is literally what the ruling was, where an Indiana mayor was convicted for accepting $10,000 after he had delivered a municipal contract to a local company. He got the $10,000 from the local company, and he was convicted of that. And the Supreme Court intervened to overturn that conviction, arguing that because of the sequence of events, that $10,000 was not a bribe. That $10,000 was a permissible gratuity, like a tip. That's where we are. And I
Yeah.
think the effect of that is to say, listen, all you folks who are worried about corruption is just government now. It's just the way business is done. This is no longer illegal. It's no longer scandalous. It's no longer even anomalous. This is what government is now. And I think that's where they're attempting to land the sort of the final stage of their master plan.
Well, and I'm laughing because what there's been very little commentary on is your description of what the mayor did for a grand total of $14,000 is what Clarence Thomas has done for in amounts ranging into the millions, and arguably Samuel Alito and perhaps Chief Justice Roberts as well, and nobody recused themselves.
Right. And to your point, that context of Alito, Thomas, et cetera, being lavished with expensive gifts while issuing rulings that affect essentially the people, or at least the class of people, the kind of people who are making the gifts. That context being left out of the relatively minimal coverage of these corruption cases, the string of corruption cases to legalize corruption cases. Leaving out that context leaves out the potential motive of some of these justices in handing down such ridiculous rulings. If you're on the Supreme Court and billionaires are giving you gifts, taking you on trips, et cetera, doing favor, financial, all sorts of gifts, and you're hearing cases that are relatively related to their industries, to them specifically, and you're doing that and not recusing yourself. Well, when a case comes down to say, hey, we want to overturn bribery, arguably you have a motive to want to make sure that bribery is not considered a crime, not considered a prosecutable crime.
I think a tremendous intersection here with a lot of stuff that we've been doing, David, over the course of time. Mind blowing when I consider your work with Alex Gibney, of course, and Alex Gibney have done Dark Money off the book of Mayor from the Atlantic, and all things backdoor. But we also happen to work with, had the great fortune working with Jesse Eisinger at ProPublica, and boy, did ProPublica do some magnificent work early. And I know you did too. Actually, you guys broke the story of wow, that's amazing. I'm sorry. Do you want to comment on that real quick when you first
Yeah,
started
I think you're
discovering?
talking about the story we did in partnership with ProPublica, which was
Yeah.
the story about the largest dark money transfer in the history of the country. Or let me amend that: the largest known
Known.
dark money transfer in the history of the country, because of course dark money is anonymous money, so we don't know what we don't know. So in that story that we broke open, Leonard Leo's network, Leonard Leo being a very serious participant in the master plan, a conservative activist focused specifically on taking over the courts, packing the courts, a Federalist Society, and the like. As we broke open, the private owner of one of the largest privately held companies in the country, an electronics company, essentially bequeathed the proceeds of his company's sale. I forget the exact number now. It was a couple of years ago, but a couple $1 billion. Bequeathed it, essentially transferred that to Leonard Leo's network, to the tune of, again, a couple $1 billion. Dark money that is used by Leonard Leo. I don't think he would dispute that he's a political activist. And the only way that transfer was known was because of the reporting that we did. And I say that not to pat our reporting on the back. I say that to say that there's no systemic set of laws to require at least even the disclosure of that, much less to prohibit it. It's like a snapshot of the extent of what we don't know, the extent of the money being funneled into politics that we don't even know about, right? We know the money being pumped into politics when somebody like Elon Musk intervenes in the election and says, yes, I'm spending, $200 million to help Donald Trump get elected. So we know that. What we don't have any real sense of the full extent of is how much money is being poured into politics to buy elections, sway legislators, sway legislation. How much of that do we not know if we only got lucky to find a snapshot of a couple $1 billion being poured into politics? It gives you a sense of the unknown universe and the unknown size of the set of forces that are really manipulating the political system on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Paul, it obviously kind of makes me think of you and your expertise, particularly after all things that have just been revealed recently with Jason Leopold, and we know what the ICIJ did with the suspicious activity reports and all the things that you've seen from the very, inside level. I mean, what comes to your mind as it relates to this discussion?
Well, what comes to my mind is that um, the problem that David and June are talking about, particularly David, is the sort of the legalized corruption, how corporate America has sort of influenced courts and legislature to sort of legalize corruption. There's still all kinds of illegal corruption that's out there, including fraud. And what I worry about, and David, love to sort of hear your views on this. I'm sure I know what they are. Is what Trump is doing now is as he eviscerates the expertise in the Department of Justice, he's affecting the ability of prosecutors to go after illegal corruption and fraud. So while I agree with you, we have that legalized corruption that's been going on since the Powell memo that needs to be addressed, and hopefully someday, maybe with the backlash of what's going on now, the next administration will address it. But the bigger problem I see going forward is what I call the ability to tackle legal corruption. So remember, the Department, in my view, the Department of Justice had been pretty good at tackling sort of the illegal part of the corruption. Of course, when we experienced the great financial crisis, we saw how corporate influences eroded through a whole bunch of ways that Jesse Eisinger has pointed out, the ability of the department to tackle it, and what I say is the competence of the department to tackle it. But it was all the levers to go after illegal corruption remained. Now we have Trump in there, eradicating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement. The ability of the SEC to enforce corruption laws and fraud laws against all these type of Bitcoin and any type of company that deals in crypto. They've affected the SEC's ability to go after that. And so we have all of these things happen in the administration with the firings of prosecutors. So it's going to take a long time in the next generations of experienced prosecutors to beat that down. So I see both of those things happening in a real way to further complicate the issue you're talking about, David. And I will say, just to sort of put a spin on what you're talking about in the Indiana mayor case, I see it a little bit differently. I think the motive of the Supreme Court justices, including the one who wrote this opinion, is exactly what you say it is. I think the motive is bad. But remember, that was charged under a statute called 18 U.S.C. 666, which is theft of government program bribery. And so I don't see it as drastic as you do. I think the motive was bad, and I think that they are trying to affect the ability of prosecutors to go after certain levels of bribery. But remember, federal bribery by federal officials remains illegal. Federal laws against federal agents and employees from both making a gratuity and a bribe still exist. What that case was about, and I have been preaching to prosecutors for years that they are, with respect to 18 U.S.C. 666, they were cheating. How are they cheating? 18 U.S.C. 666 governs, uses a term called bribery. And they were prosecuting it without defining whether a gratuity or a bribery was being paid. And I always thought that was a huge problem, because what Clarence Thomas said was, if Congress wanted to affect state gratuities, they would have said it. They said bribery. It's a different statute. If the prosecutors had proved and charged bribery in that case, we wouldn't be in this problem. Instead, they only proved gratuity. And what Justice Thomas said is that a gratuity in the state of Indiana is not illegal. So you can't federalize the federal bribery statute and use it against a state public official to prosecute a gratuity. So again, I absolutely want to say that these bribery statutes against federal employees and federal officials still remain in force as it relates to gratuity. But if you're going to go after state officials using this statute, which 18 U.S.C. 201, the federal bribery statute, doesn't impact, then the prosecutors need to be specific about charging a bribery, not a gratuity. So I'm sorry to go into that much detail, but I don't see that as radical as other people see it. That being said, I do think the motive of the Supreme Court and the court opinions are terrible for prosecutors who want to go against corruption. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean, I take it as I think, I guess I would respond to that and say, I think you can take each of the cases in this line of jurisprudence and say they each had different factors. Maybe some of them were a deviation from the mean, right?
yeah,
Some of them had intervening factors, but the general trend in the Supreme Court, I would say, and maybe I would date it to either the Skilling case or maybe the Bob McDonnell case, the Virginia governor, the overturning of saying that the governor providing access to other officials, facilitating access to officials in his administration to a donor that was giving him and his wife gifts, that is not a quote unquote official act. See, what I see it as is the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court, constantly looking to narrow, to make it harder and harder. And each case, then you go to the Chris Christie Bridgegate case, overturning that, the Andrew Cuomo cases, overturning those cases. Then you could even bring in the Ted Cruz case, which is on the other sort of the other side, that the Ted Cruz case was about whether you can have your donors repay the loans that you've made to your campaign, essentially at an interest rate, right? Like you take all of this and you see a Supreme Court that is whittling down the ability of good prosecutors to successfully prosecute cases. And I want to get to the enforcement part because I think you bring up a really good point. But before I do, I think the first place that we're seeing some of the effects of Donald Trump is in how people are now appealing to the Supreme Court. So there's this case in Cincinnati, a corruption case, where a local city council person, actually a Democrat, was convicted of receiving a series of under the law legal campaign contributions, disclosed, et cetera, et cetera. But the argument was that it was an explicit quid pro quo for his support of a municipal project. And the way that the case went down was that you can't get money disclosed or undisclosed, in an envelope or in a campaign check in exchange for an explicit favor that you're going to do as a public official. The quid pro quo, the oldest thing that the government has said, this is not okay. The councilman gets convicted. Donald Trump gets in office, makes a big show of pardoning the councilman. He's already served time. He's pardoned. Nonetheless, he's appealing his conviction and what's interesting here, what the tell to me is, I mean, yeah, I guess having a conviction on your record there's a consequence, I guess a social consequence to that. But like, you've already served time, et cetera, et cetera. You've already gotten your punishment. It's the first known appeal of a conviction after somebody's been pardoned, right? Now you got your pardon, you've been pardoned. And all of the groups that have been the conservative groups that have been part of the master plan are behind this case, are pushing this case because they see something to get out of this case. And what I think is really important, I should mention that Donald Trump's former solicitor is now representing the appeal in this case. And the tell to me here of the effect of Donald Trump in normalizing corruption is that the appeal, if you read the appeal to overturn the conviction, even though he's already been pardoned, there's a part where the appeal says it cites the case in the 2024 election, the situation in the 2024 election where Donald Trump reportedly went in front of a bunch of fossil fuel donors and said, "You give me $1 billion to help my campaign, and I will give you a bunch of favors." Right? I mean, that is reported to be what happened. Let's stipulate that reporting is solid. And what the appeal says is, if we allow this conviction of this city councilman to stand, it could allow any prosecutor to prosecute somebody like Donald Trump soliciting the fossil fuel industry for $1 billion in exchange for policy favors. as if that would be a bad thing, as if that would be out of control and unacceptable. In other words, where we are now in the Trump era is citing the, at minimum, shady behavior and transactional behavior of Donald Trump to say we should not treat such behavior as prosecutable. That would be too dangerous to the country. So to me, that is a reflection of how normalized the Donald Trump's process of even further normalizing corruption, to say that if we allow prosecutors to prosecute this, it's effectively prosecuting what we should consider to be normal, run-of-the-mill, day-to-day politics. We're criminalizing politics. So that's the first way I think Donald Trump is taking this farther. To your point about enforcement, that's the whole other long-lasting legacy of I think what will be with Trump, which is the executive branch gets to decide in our system what gets enforced and what doesn't. And clearly Donald Trump is using that authority in all sorts of ways, but specifically when it comes to corruption, to defund and gut the public corruption unit at DOJ, the directives about whether or not the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act will be enforced and how companies should think about all of that will have a cumulative effect of for future generations. How do we even rebuild the capacity to 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 prosecute cases that are now, because of what's gone on in the court, harder to prosecute on their merits? In other words, it's a two-pronged attack. We have fewer people who even know how to prosecute this. The infrastructure of actually enforcing the law has been gutted because of Trump. And these are now more difficult cases to prosecute because of how the courts have interpreted and narrowed the law.
Well, and that's the perfect tee up for the next person to talk to about this, which is William K. Black, who I know has a whole constellation of answers to that. But I do want to set this up from this perspective, Bill. I've seen a lot of interviews with David as it relates to, his book and really boy, what was the terminology that used? It was like a dystopia of corruption, right? That I loved how you described that, David. But we're talking decades in the making. We're talking paradigmatic. We're talking smart people. We're talking, Lewis Powell. We're talking tobacco industry and corporate influence, which you've been a part of in prosecuting for now 35 years. And one thing that Mr. Sirota has constantly referred to, of course, is your favorite nemesis, Charles Keating, and all things that came out of that era. And I've seen David quote Charles Keating, and he missed the one quote that I've always hung my hat on, which Charles also said as it relates to the gentleman on this call, is kill black, kill him dead. That's how far these guys used to want to take it. So, Bill, what's your response as we're moving through this dialogue?
Yeah, I actually said highest priority. Get black,
Wow.
kill him dead.
Wow.
Uh, so my first message, don't just buy this book, or if you can't afford to, go to the library and read this book. Read it carefully, right? Don't skim it. It really does set forth essential facts, and it has reportage that never existed before this inquiry. And the picture of the party with the robe is worth 3 times the price of the book.
Yeah. For those who don't know, just to interject for a sec, we uncovered this record cover, and it was a fascinating, just as an aside about how we found it. So Lewis Powell was a tobacco lawyer, gets appointed to the court by Richard Nixon, and Philip Morris holds a celebration party, a send-off party, and we were sort of doing a bunch of research, and we came upon tobacco settlement documents, sort of totally unrelated, and from the big tobacco prosecution cases, many decades later, and there was this very weird transcript of a like Walter Cronkite, the old show You Are There, a transcript of a You Are There about Lewis Powell's life, and we were like, what could this be? We couldn't figure out what this was. So one of our reporters goes to the Powell archive and is digging around to try to figure out what this is and can't figure it out. And as he's about to leave, he sort of asks, "Is there anything else we haven't looked through?" And the archivist says, "Oh, there's this box over here of records." And they sort of dust off this box. They open this box, and out comes this vinyl record with a cover of the recording of the send-off party of Lewis Powell, the Philip Morris send-off party. Apparently, they used to press vinyl records as kind of novelty items on, on parties that you'd go to, and it's got the audio of literally Walter Cronkite, who emceed the event, doing a kind of hagiographic, valorizing sort of send up of "You Are There" to honor Lewis Powell. Remember, Walter Cronkite's and I'm not trying to like disrespect Walter Cronkite, a great reporter in many respects, but like Walter Cronkite is the anchor of CBS News hosting a corporate event for the send off of Lewis Powell. And like valorizing him, and it's a long way of getting to the fact that on the cover of the album is a set of pictures and one of them is the Philip Morris CEO presenting Lewis Powell with judicial robes emblazoned with tobacco industry corporate logos on it, which is like people joke about the idea of like politicians should have like NASCAR jerseys with the names of the brands that they're sponsored by. I mean, that literally happened in 1971 with Lewis Powell. So just for people who don't know about that, because I'm really glad you mentioned that, because when we found that record, it was like I was like, I cannot believe this is real. Like it's hard to believe. This feels fake. This is so ridiculous, but it is entirely real.
And I want you to know the sincerity of my endorsement of this book because I am at the center of a number of the episodes here, and it is my life's work as an academic, and I'm not never quoted once. So, uh, so this is really wonderful piece, and as I say, it shows reporters can add things that academic types would never have the resources or way of thinking to find these things. This does sum it up. It is astonishing. And indeed, just to add, the reportage also shows that Justice Powell sent a thank you note in which he said that the best thing he received at this party was those robes, which is so grotesquely inappropriate that it sheds a real light on this man's morals, which were sadly lacking. Let me give you a feel also, at least my feel, for the Powell Memorandum and what you need to remember about Powell. This is not contrary to anything David says, it's just a different point of emphasis. Powell was one of the best lawyers in America, which has the best lawyers in the world. He was really good. And he wasn't just really good as a lawyer, as David's book points out. He was on the board of directors of at least uh, two major corporations that what they did for a living was kill Americans in substantial part. One was the tobacco industry, but the other was Ethel. And Ethel was created by a combination of two industries to create leaded gasoline. Killed hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people globally, reduced the IQ of probably 150 or more million Americans, was heavily concentrated in inner city areas along the interstates and major drives, commute drives, so that way disproportionately the lead was concentrated in areas where blacks lived and such. Um, as soon as they introduced it, they killed 24 of their own workers. Nationally scandalous, a cover up for effectively for 50 years. Tobacco, again, really good lawyers, and they shape the law, which is what a large part of what we've really been discussing here is. It's that power and the foresight to shape the law. And that in this case, they shaped tort law such that the cigarette companies always won. I don't mean nearly always. I mean they won every one of the tort suits against very good plaintiffs' lawyers to, indifferently qualified plaintiffs' lawyers. Powell recognizes that the right is losing in key spheres, and he is sounding an alarm in the Powell memorandum. In vernacular, he's saying we're getting our asses kicked in a bunch of sectors that are actually going to be critical. The people on the left are more honest, more blunt, more interesting as folks. They're doing their research and they're exposing our crimes, and the people are turning against us. Now, the full degree had not occurred, and that again says very good things about Powell's analytics. He was seeing the future. And who was his real passion for in that memorandum? That was this guy, an immigrant family from Lebanon, of all things, Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader says, they're crooks. Well, you can see from everything we've been discussing with the racing logos and such, he was incapable of thinking of these people as crooks, Lewis Powell, but he also knew they were crooks and murderers. And that if the Ralph Naders of the world were allowed to continue and to continue to win in explaining to people what was happening, the law could be used very effectively against him. And that's why in the savings and loan debacle, from a starting position that Ed Gray inherits, he was the chairman of the federal agency regulating it, appointed by Ronald Reagan and a personal friend of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. The starting point was there wasn't even a criminal referral process. So we had to create a criminal referral process from scratch. We had to get a Justice Department that had zero interest in prosecuting to make it a major priority. I've talked about it in this podcast, how we deliberately embarrassed them, putting out the monthly figures and then, going to the Washington Post and explaining, yeah, it's now up to 7,000, no prosecutions type of thing. Eventually, they sue for peace. At that point, precisely what Lewis Powell knew and was warning the business class about kicks in. Because it turns out once you start the Justice Department moving, and once you start America moving, which has, as I've noted, more whistleblowers than the rest of the world combined, and at very high level, that I don't mean they're more important because they're high level. I mean they have much more access to information, much more access to where the key documents are. They understand. They were in direct conversations with C-suite people where they can send them to prison and such. Lewis Powell understood all of this latent power of the Justice Department, which was about to kick in under Ed Gray. And so Ed Gray and his counterpart, Bill Siegman at the FDIC, and then eventually enormous cooperative work with the FBI and the Department of Justice, produce over 7,000 felony convictions in cases designated as major. And that includes collectively over 500 CEOs or equivalent. Officer titles vary, right? Absolutely unprecedented. And what comes after that are crackdowns in a bunch of these other areas. There are crackdowns in lead in gasoline. There are crackdowns on black lung. There are crackdowns. The Justice Department finally sues the tobacco manufacturers, does exhaustive discovery. There's years-long trial, uh, 2,000-page district court opinion or thereabouts, like 300 pages on how they manipulate nicotine levels alone in terms of the findings. June and I were both federal programs branch attorneys. I defended the constitutionality and statutory authority of the Black Lung program and such, and we did many other such programs, and worked with Paul's counterparts earlier, in time on all of these things. And the Justice Department, from almost a standing start, became this incredible entity that was getting more than 90% conviction rates against CEOs who have the best criminal defense lawyers in the world and they'll spend money like water to defend themselves. So that's for me, the really amazing thing about Powell is how he was able to look to the future and see this need that the capacity of the federal government and the movements of the people developed by people like Ralph Nader and investigative reporters, that's what they feared. They fear us, a knowledgeable, motivated American people, because we have the ability and the institutions to literally destroy these criminal enterprises. And these are criminal enterprises. And yes, they are the biggest predators in the world in terms of money, but they also kill more people and maim more people than all the blue collar criminals in the history of the world have done, unless you count the Nazis and wartime type stuff. So that's why, as as people that study elite white collar crime, and I will tell you, as a financial regulator, at that time, my mantra, which I repeated to thousands of people, was the highest return on assets is always a political contribution, right? It was always the prominent politicians running the equivalent of a Green Bay sweep to try to crush us. So again, I'll leave you with how I started. This is not only a great book, it's a vital book. And it's a vital book to being an effective citizen and be of good cheer. Again, we can reverse this. And indeed, that is Powell's insight. He feared us. He feared people like Ralph Nader. He feared how the government was starting to concentrate on these health violations. And he was scared to death that the American people would listen to what they were hearing and demand a change in policies.
You should know one of our subscribers, after we published the book, sent us so Powell writes his memo in August of 1971. A few months beforehand, Nader had been featured in a big story in Fortune magazine, sort of summarizing all of his success up until that point. And one of our subscribers, and the idea is that in part, Powell read this article and was real pissed off about it, was really like sort of a catalyst for him in his brain. And one of our subscribers actually mailed us an original copy of that Fortune magazine article. And it is like, if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't really know. But if you know what you're looking at, you're like, wow, like this is, it's just, I don't know, like to see it and to see what Lewis Powell was responding to. You could totally imagine that a tobacco executive who's or a board member who's helping, advise the tobacco industry at a time when the public is starting to ask questions, and, is also giving these speeches,
And leaded gasoline
and
in
let
the
it gasoline, right? And it's giving these speeches fearing, the movements of the 1960s. You could totally imagine him, reading this in his and his business pals' favorite magazine and saying, you know what, this has gone too far. And the butterfly flaps its wings, as the old saying goes, and here we are.
and again, he was the consigliere, right?
Right.
He recognized how badly GM had screwed up in response to Nader. If
Yeah.
people don't know, they sicked detectives on him. They tried for a honey trap to get him in, some embarrassing sexual situation. They then lied about this, and Ralph persisted and persisted and persisted, and it came out, and they had to do, of course, a public apology in front of Congress and such. But the point was, this little guy, right? No one had ever heard of, with, a Lebanese descent, God forbid, and such, took down the, at that time, most famous corporation, not just in America, but in the world, and beat the shit out of them.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and in passing, as I recall, I believe that Keating tried to sue you for 400 million or something to that
He
effect.
didn't try, he did.
He did. That's right. So David, just extraordinary work on your behalf. You always put your best foot forward, and I want to just finish this dialogue with, the revelation. You asked a couple of things that we're still in the midst of. What can be done, right? And you have stated about the states, and I'd love you to maybe give some closing commentary on that. That makes you hopeful. But what we learned, for example, and you and I both know what took place during the Obama administration. You and Alex Gibney, of course, did a magnificent long form, podcast featuring, of course, Paul Peltier and several other folks that we know. And you definitely, put the eye on the failures of the Obama administration to put us in this situation. We learned in our work the con firsthand from the FBI after, Bill and his cohorts managed something along the lines of north of 30,000 criminal referrals during the era of the savings and loan crisis. We learned that the FBI provided zero in the great financial crisis that was 180 times larger than the savings and loan crisis. We know this doesn't get easier. When the shackles come off, these guys go big. And like I started off the conversation with the satire of Donald Trump naming obviously battleships after him, given everything that we're in the midst of. You had said frequently recently that this is probably the most important effort in your career so far, which is saying something considering all of your accomplishments. Why don't you put a fine tooth comb on it and tell us what makes you hopeful and what obviously is reality based on where you're sitting?
And if you could, David, if you could let us know if you think there's a tipping point, what is it? Tipping point for the American people, what is it, and how can we get there faster?
So,
And if I can add in, what to do about the Supreme Court. Uh,
yeah. Yeah, I mean
A
that's
lot.
yeah. So I would say on the tipping point question, I do think Donald Trump has done everyone a favor in this way. Most of my adult life, there has been this idea that soft corruption is designed to sort of hold out the idea that we're not actually being the corruption doesn't actually exist. There's sort of these pretenses of, whether it was the legal fiction of soft money or these sort of artificial boundaries between a politicians, what they do in their public office versus what they do in the campaign. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is there was this idea that, like, yeah, we can all be immersed in the political system can be immersed in money, but if there's not a provable quid pro quo, then it's not really corruption, right? I can give somebody access. I can listen more to my donors than voters. But if I'm not doing a quid pro quo, then it's not really corruption. Okay. All that's gone now, right? That pretense is gone, right? I don't think, I think what Donald Trump has done, I've said this before, I'll say it again. Donald Trump is a pathological liar, statement by statement, but he's actually maybe the most honest president ever in the sense of vibes, right? He doesn't pretend to see the presidency as anything other than transactional, right? So like, yeah, like he'll say things that are not true all the time, but vibe wise, brand wise, the politics is now an auction under Donald Trump. I don't think he really pretends anything else. I mean, he would almost argue that like if running the government transactionally, maybe his argument is government's always been transactional. I'm just blatant about it. I'm just explicit about it, and I'll do it better than anyone else. I mean, so I guess my point is you don't have to convince anyone anymore that the system is endemically corrupt. I think Donald Trump has done that favor to America to say, I am, and the government is flagrantly corrupt, and that's just the way things are. So that has advanced the terms of the discourse in a way where you don't have to convince anyone anymore. So I do think that's part of the tipping point here. Everyone, or almost everybody, thinks the government is super, super corrupt and thinks corporate America at the highest reaches is super corrupt. So that is an opportunity. Now, I think obviously the question is, are we going to accept it or not? And I think the master planners hope that people will simply accept that there's nothing that can be done, and that will accept that this is just the way things are. But I think the corruption crisis mixed with the economic affordability crisis, which, by the way, the idea that the affordability crisis is new is so absurd. I every time I hear it, I get super angry, right? Like, I mean, Bernie Sanders has been talking about the affordability crisis for 50 years, right? What do we talk? It's a new thing. I mean, everyone who says that the affordability crisis is new is basically telling on themselves about how privileged they are, right? I mean, the affordability crisis has been long in the making. And so I think the corruption crisis mixed with the affordability crisis becoming even more acute offers a moment of opportunity to say this doesn't have to be this way. And I think there are specific things that can be done when it comes to corruption to reduce corruption in a real way. The Democrats in Congress, as one example, have a bill that should be the absolute most minimal thing to do, which is dark money needs to be at least disclosed. We should at least know who is spending money in our elections. And as bad and in a lot of ways systemically corrupt as the Democratic Party leadership is, all the Democrats are on that bill. Not saying they're great. I'm just saying like that, even at the highest reaches of that party, that particular issue has been litigated. Now it's a question of whether they can be pushed to do it. But that's like the most minimal, like really, truly the most minimal thing. People in states can actually do things. Arizona passed a version of that at the ballot. Arizona, not exactly a super blue state. It's a purple state. Maine has passed a bill, has passed legislation to do a similar thing. So I think at the state level, there are lots of things that can be done. And the thing I'm most encouraged by right now, as we talk here today, is in Montana, there's a ballot measure to try to go at this in a different direction, which is to use the Supreme Court's precedent on business incorporation, not on campaign finance, but on business incorporation, to restrict the power of corporations and what they can and cannot do inside of individual states. And to be clear, every state does not have to pass this for this to start having an effect. And the basic summary is that the Supreme Court, the Citizens United ruling is predicated on the idea that corporations are people, and if money is constitutionally protected speech, then corporations as people are entitled to those constitutional rights. But that decision is predicated on the idea that states are the ones that get to say what corporations are. And that essentially over the last 100 years, states have said for purposes under our law, corporations are people. But states don't have to say that. And this is why this situation in Montana is so interesting. Because essentially at the ballot, what they're proposing to do is for Montana to say, you know what? We're going to scrap our whole corporate code. We're going to reinstate it, everything except for one thing. Corporations have all the power that they had in the past when they're operating in our state. They have all the same powers except for one power. Corporations cannot spend money in elections. And the idea is that the Supreme, if and when that passes, if and when it gets to the Supreme Court would have to, in order to stop it. Now, I wouldn't put it past the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court would have to undo a lot of its own precedents to say that states are not allowed to decide the terms upon which corporations exist.
David, what was that word you used? Precedent?
Yeah, right. I know, and the Supreme Court doesn't really listen to its own precedents. But I think the point here is that and I'm not a lawyer, but the way I understand it is
Don't
that
brag.
that it's essentially using the Supreme like a long list of Supreme Court precedents that the Supreme Court and business itself in a lot of ways arguably wants to preserve, using those precedents to say that corporations can't do, that states still have the power to say corporations can't do certain things. Like that idea that states are the ones that decide the terms of which the artificial entities, corporations exist, that idea is baked into a lot of sort of American corporate law. And so what Montana's trying to do is use that in a way that restricts the way corporations can operate in elections. And I want to be clear. This doesn't solve the problem, right? Individual billionaires can still spend money. If they spend money with other people, effectively, they'd have to disclose that money. They'd have to do it through political committees. So that would help with that. The reason I say you don't have to wait for all 50 states to do this, for it to start having effects, is that if Montana actually passed that, that's the way things would operate inside of Montana. In other words, if Montana wants to get corporate spending out of Montana's elections, that is enforceable inside of Montana. Now, it's not going to change things for me here in Colorado unless Colorado passes a version of that. And there's already legislation moving through that's going to be proposed in Colorado's legislative session to do this. Other states can do this legislatively. So I am encouraged by the innovative way that states are starting to think about this. There's a whole other case out of Maine where Maine passed a measure to restrict the amount that anybody can give to a super PAC. Right now, the whole thing is that, unlimited spending, you do it through super PACs. You can give as much as you want. This is creating a constitutional challenge that is going to the Supreme Court through Larry Lessig, who's taking it to the Supreme Court to try to essentially use other Supreme Court precedents to say that super PACs can be regulated. Again, this I would agree. This all does go up against the Supreme Court itself. How to change the Supreme Court? That's term limits. There's all sorts of. That's a whole topic of discussion, and I don't have a perfect answer for that. I would just say, short of how to change the Supreme Court, trying to use the Supreme Court's own precedents is, I think, an exciting development, or at least perhaps the best tactic that can be done, rather than trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn its own Citizens United precedent. That's what's interesting about these cases that I've just discussed. Now, to me, the gold standard of dealing with this problem, and again, none of these are perfect fixes, but I wrote a piece in The Nation about how the big takeaway for me in the New York mayor's race, a lot of people talking about Zoran Mamdani. How did he win? Oh, he had a great message and affordability, and he's a very charismatic candidate, and his ads were great, and his social media was great. All that's true. To my mind, having worked on lots of campaigns, there's one factor that if Zoran Mamdani did not have, he would not have become mayor. He probably might not have even really been a candidate for mayor. And that was that city has an 8-to-1 matching system of public financing of elections, which allows candidates to run the kind of campaign on the kind of messages that Zoran Mamdani ran on and have enough money not to outspend the opponent, but to at least be competitive. Public financing of elections is whereby candidates who raise a certain amount of small dollar donations qualify for public matching funds, essentially. The idea being it's a source of money that allows candidates to run competitively, a source of money that does not come with the expectation of legislative favors, the expectation that comes with private money. And so I think to look at New York, forget about, and just to be clear, I don't care if you're watching this and you're a conservative, a libertarian, a socialist, a Democrat, you know, these systems are ideology free, right? If you want to run as a libertarian and you don't want to have to go and ask liberal donors for money, public financing of elections is a way to get access to that money to allow you to run a competitive campaign. Conservative, Democrat, socialist, that's the beauty of these systems. And the thing is, to go back to the Supreme Court limited Arizona's public financing system. And to go back to the Keating 5 scandal, John McCain, who was singed by the Keating 5 scandal, sort of came out of that scandal with the zeal of a convert to campaign finance reform. And in his own state, they created one of the first statewide, might have been the first statewide public financing system of elections. And they included a provision that said when a publicly financed candidate is outspent by super PACs on the other side, it's called sort of a millionaire's amendment, they get additional public financing. And the Supreme Court rejected that provision on First Amendment grounds, saying, there's a sort of a standard Roberts Supreme Court argument. But in that ruling, the court says we don't have a quarrel with the concept of public financing of elections. In other words, even the Roberts Court was like, look, these systems are under our Citizens United paradigm. These systems do not have a constitutional problem. And I think it's worth remembering that there's been a few times in our country's past in which we've gotten very, very, very close to publicly financing congressional campaigns. There already is a presidential public financing system that has sort of become outdated and defunct for various, it could be updated. But there were times in the 1970s, there was a moment in 1992 where the Congress actually passed public financing of elections. George H.W. Bush vetoed it. The Clinton administration actually endorsed it. So I think all of this is to say there are plenty of ways to reduce corruption. We are at a tipping point moment, in my view, where we don't have to convince the public that corruption has gotten out of control. The opportunity is there to do any number of these things. And the question really is, are we going to do them? Is there enough will to do them? And that question, I don't have an answer to.
But you kind of do, David, because you do it every day. You've been battling corruption for a good portion of your career, but kudos to you for calling it out what it is at this stage in a way that I don't think I've ever heard you say until the release of this book. And I want to say to the audience out there, I mean, look behind David. He's got a basketball jersey, obviously the lover. We're all big sports fans. We know how to compete. You're looking at some of the best competitors in the legal profession that have taken down corruption for now decades. And we need to turn our eyes to the people who know how to do this instead of get lost in translation. And I'll say that, I've always said it's not just about corruption. Corruption burrs and fuels fascism. So if those are two your mortal enemies, if you stand for liberty and justice, you certainly want to find the lever. And I'm going to share once again my screen share here so that you can see the book that we've been talking about. And please don't hesitate. Get to Amazon and everywhere else. And you've got to check out Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. And as you can see on the masthead here, the lever, of course, this is David's online platform to be able to battle. And I guess in light of all things, what we're seeing, the collapse of all mainstream media right before our eyes, 60 Minutes, no less last night, because of course, everybody's favorite Barry Weiss. Independent media could not be more important. And, on behalf of our team here, I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah, of course, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. But people, if we don't come together quickly, you have to understand that nothing happens in a vacuum. This has been decades in the making. Russell Vode Project 2025, Heritage Foundation. I mean, David goes into detail about. I mean, this came from, and his name eludes me at the moment. The guy from Coors, obviously in your home state.
Joseph Course, yeah.
Yeah, was one of the original. That's before, of course, the Koch brother involvement. By the way, I was interested to learn recently that Fred Koch. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, and I'd be curious if you are. That he actually started the Jim Birch or John Birch Society. Were you guys aware of that? Just out of curiosity, everybody know
I was
that?
not.
Yeah, how about that? Not a big surprise, right? So,
Well, the Kochs had lots of things. Some of them at the beginning were outright neo-Nazi.
hmm, hmm. I actually wrote a lift in Vail, Colorado, once long ago with obviously the Coors actually family at that time, which was a little bit peculiar. So anyway, guys, please check out the newuntouchables.com. Please check out The Lever. Over the holiday, code watch, don't look up to be reminded of the insanity that we're in the midst of, because the media is actually corruption. And please check out, as you can see behind me, guys, one big solution to it all, my friends, is the Clean New Deal. On behalf of everybody, my name is Patrick Lovell signing off. All the best to you all. Onwards and upwards.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks
Merry
all.
Christmas. Merry
Great to see
Christmas.
all of you. Thanks again.